now. I am 30,000 feet over the ocean, flying home from my own anniversary trip, and the woman in the seat beside me, a friendly stranger, a little loosened by the free wine, is telling me all about the married man she just spent a romantic week with, on the very same island I am also flying home from. She has no idea who I am. And somewhere over that dark water, I am beginning to understand with terrible clarity exactly who she is. Then, 6 days earlier, my husband Spencer surprised me with a trip to celebrate 15 years of marriage. Sun, a beautiful resort, the whole grand romantic gesture. I actually cried when he told me, right there at the kitchen table, the printed itinerary in my hands. I thought it was the kindest, most thoughtful thing he had ever done for me in 15 years. It takes the woman in seat 14B about 40 minutes, somewhere over the dark water, to describe, in dreamy detail, the resort. My resort. The same beach. The same restaurants. And then, the man. My husband. The man whose ring I was still wearing. This is the story of the longest flight of my life. I'm going to tell it to you the way I lived at the trip and the flight braided together. The truth arriving one cruel altitude at a time, and what I did with everything a stranger placed in my hands at 30,000 feet. But before we take off, I want to ask you something, and I genuinely want your answer in the comments. Have you ever found out the truth about your own life from a complete stranger, someone who had no idea they were handing you the thing that would change everything? What did they say? And what did you do? Be honest. Because the most important conversation of my marriage happened with a woman who didn't even know my name. Tell me your story in the comments. I read every single one. And before we go back to the beginning of the trip, I want to say one thing to anyone watching who is, right now, sitting with a piece of truth that arrived from somewhere they didn't expect. An offhand comment, a stranger's remark, something a friend let slip. I know how tempting it is to dismiss it, to decide the source doesn't count, to tell yourself that because it didn't come to you in some official, undeniable way, you're allowed to keep not knowing. I understand that temptation, because the truth, once you let it in, demands that your life change. But the messenger doesn't determine whether something is true. A stranger on a plane is just as capable of handing you reality as a private investigator. So if the universe has placed an inconvenient truth in your path, however oddly, don't waste energy arguing with how it got there. Just look at it honestly, and let it tell you what it came to tell you. Then, let me take you back to the beginning of the trip, because I need you to understand how happy I was, so you'll understand how far I fell. Spencer had planned all of it himself, which was unusual, and which touched me. 15 years. He said he wanted it to be special, and for the first few days, it was. We walked on the beach. We had dinners by the water, and if I noticed a few small things, that he checked his phone more than usual, that he twice disappeared for an hour with a vague explanation, that he seemed, at certain moments, somewhere else entirely, I told myself I was being silly. You don't go looking for storms on a trip a man planned to celebrate loving you for 15 years. So I let the small things go, one by one, the way you brush away a worry you can't afford to have on a beautiful day. I was determined to be happy. I had no idea that the small things were the only true things on that entire island. I have thought so much since about that decision to let the small things go, because I don't think I was being foolish, and I don't want you to think you would have been foolish either. When someone you love has just made a grand gesture, planned a whole trip, said all the right words, spent the money, your mind is powerfully motivated to protect that gesture, to keep it intact. Because the alternative is unbearable. So you explain away the phone checking. You explain away the disappearances. Not because you're stupid, but because you're standing inside a beautiful thing and you don't want to be the one who breaks it. That's the cruelest genius of the anniversary trip betrayal. Specifically, he wrapped the lie in the most romantic possible packaging, knowing that the packaging itself would make me reluctant to look too closely. The grand gesture wasn't just a gift. It was camouflage. The kinder the surface looked, the harder it was for me to see what was moving underneath it. Now, back to seat 14B. Her name, she tells me as we settle in for the long flight, is Olivia. She's warm, chatty, the kind of open, easy stranger who tells you her whole life story before the seatbelt sign has even switched off. The kind you're a little grateful for on a long flight because she'll carry the conversation all by herself. And she is glowing the specific glow of a woman returning from something romantic. Good trip? I ask, because I am polite, and because I have no idea I am about to pull the pin on my own life. The best, she says, with a private little smile. I was with someone. It's complicated, but honestly, the best week of my life. And something in how she says complicated makes me look at her a little more closely. Then, day 4. The first real crack. I came back to our room earlier than expected, and Spencer was on the balcony, on the phone, and his voice had a tone in it I did not recognize, soft, intimate. A tone that was not for me. He ended the call the very moment he saw me standing in the doorway, too quickly, and turned and smiled too widely, and said it was just work. And I smiled back and said okay, because I was still, even then, choosing the trip over the truth. But something cold had entered me. The vacation had a hairline fracture in it now, and I could feel it spreading. If you've ever felt that exact moment, the hairline fracture, the tone in a voice that isn't meant for you, the smile that's a half second too wide, do me one quick favor before I tell you what Olivia said next. Tap like and subscribe to the channel. I'm not asking for nothing. These calm revenge stories get buried by the algorithm unless people actually engage. And your one tap is the only reason the next one reaches a woman who is tonight feeling her own hairline fracture spread. And believe me, what a stranger told me at 30,000 feet is the part you came for. Now, Olivia, 2 glasses of wine in, wants to talk about him. And I have to make a choice in real time about what kind of passenger I am going to be for the rest of this flight. I could shut the conversation down, put in my earphones, end it, protect myself from whatever is coming. Every instinct of self-preservation says to look away. But there is another instinct, quieter and harder, that says, no. Lean in, you need to hear this, all of it, however much it hurts. I chose to lean in. I chose, in that seat, to be brave enough to hear the truth about my own life rather than comfortable enough to avoid it. And so I turned slightly toward her, and I made my face warm and open, and I invited the very conversation that was about to break my heart. People always want to talk about the person, when they're falling. He's married, she admits eventually. A little guilty, a little defiant, lowering her voice the way people do when they're about to confess the part they know they should be ashamed of. But it's basically over. He told me. They're more like roommates. He's going to leave her, he just has to handle it carefully, because of money, because of the house. And I nod, sympathetically. The understanding stranger, the safe shoulder, while every single word lands in me like a stone dropping into a deep, dark well, ripple after ripple. Because I have heard this man's promises before. They were once made to me. That was the moment, somewhere over the ocean, when the heartbreak split into 2 separate kinds of pain, and I want to name them both, because I think they're different and both real. The first pain was the obvious one. My husband was cheating. But the second pain, the one that actually took my breath away, was hearing my own history played back to me in a stranger's voice. The it's basically over. That they're more like roommates. That he just has to handle the money and the house carefully. These were not new lies. These were the recycled scripts of a man who clearly had a routine, who had said versions of these things before, possibly many times, to many women. Olivia thought she was special. She thought she was the great love who'd finally pulled him out of a dead marriage. And I recognized, with awful clarity, that she was simply the current occupant of a role, reciting lines I might have believed myself 15 years ago. He hadn't fallen for someone. He had a system, and I had been, once, exactly where she was sitting. Then, day 5. I almost caught them. I saw Spencer across the resort at a restaurant I hadn't known he'd gone to, sitting with a woman. I only saw the back of her, briefly, before a crowd moved between us. He'd told me he was going to the gym. I stood there with my heart pounding, and I told myself, one last desperate time, that it was nothing, a colleague, a coincidence. I went back to our room. I did not confront him. I think some part of me already knew that I needed to be sure and calm, and not on an island where I was trapped with him for 2 more days, before I did anything at all. That instinct to wait until I was off the island turned out to be one of the smartest things I did, and I want to explain the logic of it, because it applies far beyond a resort. When you discover a betrayal in a place where you are physically trapped with the person, you are at your most vulnerable and your least powerful. On that island, 2 days from home, I had nowhere to go, no support around me, no ability to act on anything, and every chance of dissolving into a confrontation that would accomplish nothing except warning him. A scene there would have ruined the rest of the trip, alerted Spencer, and changed nothing about the underlying facts, so the wisest move was to hold it to carry the unbearable knowledge quietly through 2 more days of forced smiles, and wait until I was back on solid ground, near my own resources, my own people, my own options, before I let a single thing show. It is one of the hardest disciplines there is, acting normal beside someone who has just broken your heart. But the alternative was to detonate my only advantage in the worst possible place. So, I waited. And the waiting put a plane, and a stranger, directly in my path. Now, Olivia is showing me a photo on her phone. "This is us," she says, on the beach. And there, on the screen, beside this glowing stranger, with his arm wrapped around her and a smile I have known better than my own for 15 years, is my husband. Spencer, on our anniversary trip. On the beach where we walked, the breath goes out of me, slow and complete, like the whole cabin had quietly lost its pressure and only I could feel it. But 15 years of quietly holding myself together has taught me something, and I do not let my face change by so much as a flicker. I look at the photo of my husband and his mistress, and I say warmly, "What a handsome guy. You look really happy." And Olivia beams and keeps talking. I want to tell you what it actually cost me to keep my face still in that moment. Looking at a photo of my own husband with his arm around the woman beside me, because I think the calm in these stories can sound effortless, and it never is. Inside, I was in free fall. My heart was slamming, my hands wanted to shake, there was a scream sitting right behind my teeth, and I had to override every single one of those signals and produce, instead, a warm smile and the words, "What a handsome guy." It was the hardest piece of acting I have ever done, and I did it for one reason, because I understood that my composure, in that exact second, was worth more than my honesty. If my face had cracked, Olivia would have stopped talking, the gift would have closed, and I'd have traded a fortune of truth for one moment of authentic reaction. So I held the scream behind my teeth, and I smiled at the photograph of my husband's betrayal, and I said the kind thing, and I kept the channel open, and I keep listening. Because she does not know who I am, and a woman who doesn't know who you are will tell you absolutely everything. There is a strange and important truth in that, and it goes far beyond my one strange flight. We are never more honest than when we believe we're talking to someone who has no stake in our story. Olivia had no reason to soften anything, no reason to spin, no reason to protect anyone's feelings, because as far as she knew, I was just a sympathetic stranger she would never see again, the safest possible audience for a secret. And so she gave me the unvarnished version. The one Spencer himself would have died before letting me hear. The one even my closest friends might have softened to spare me. The wife always gets the managed story. The stranger gets the true one. That is why, sitting in that seat, I made the decision I made. I understood that I had stumbled into the one situation in the entire world where the complete, unprotected truth about my own marriage was being offered to me freely, and that the price of keeping that gift flowing was simply to remain, in her eyes, no one at all. So I became no one. And no one, it turns out, gets to hear everything. And so, at 30,000 feet, the now and the then finally braided together into one complete and terrible picture. The work calls on the balcony her. The disappearance is her. The restaurant where he was supposed to be at the gym her. The anniversary trip he'd planned so thoughtfully, the grand gesture that made me cry he had brought his mistress along on it. He had been running 2 romances on the same island, in the same week, juggling his wife and his girlfriend between the same beaches and the same restaurants, slipping between 2 rooms and 2 women and 2 completely different beautiful stories, somehow keeping them from ever crossing, telling each of us, with the same warm face, a different version of forever. And now, by some twist of fate, both of his carefully separated stories were belted into the same row of the same airplane, breathing the same recycled air, and only one of us knew it. Now, here is the single most important decision I made in this entire story, and I made it in seat 14A, with a smile still on my face. I did not tell Olivia who I was. I did not make a scene at 30,000 feet. Because in that moment I understood that this stranger, who had no idea she was talking to the wife, was handing me something extraordinary. The entire truth, freely, in detail, with no reason to lie. The moment I revealed myself, the gift would stop. So I stayed the kind, curious stranger, and over the rest of that flight, gently and without a single leading question that could give me away, I let Olivia tell me everything. And she told me everything. How long it had been going on, far longer than one trip. The things Spencer had told her about me, the story in which I was the cold, distant wife he was trapped with, the promises he'd made her about the future they were supposedly building, and, crucially, the practical details, the trips he'd taken her on, the gifts, the things he'd spent on this second life. I wasn't just hearing about my heartbreak. I was, without her ever knowing it, taking a deposition from the one witness in the world with no reason to protect my husband. And I want to be clear about something, because it matters both morally and practically. I never tricked her, never pumped her with sneaky questions, never manipulated a word out of her. I simply listened. She volunteered all of it, freely, to a stranger she liked. Because that's what lonely, in love, slightly tipsy people do on long flights they talk. All I did was not stop her, and not lie about who I was when she'd never asked. There's an important distinction there. Gathering the truth that someone freely hands you is not deception. It's just paying attention. The only person doing any deceiving on that entire island, and in that entire airplane, was the man who had told 2 different women 2 different stories and assumed the world was large enough to keep them apart. It wasn't. And when his 2 stories ended up belted into the same row, all I had to do was sit quietly and let his own lies introduce themselves to each other. Now, landing, as the plane descended, I felt something settle in me that I had not expected. Not just grief, but a strange, steadying clarity. By the time the wheels touched the ground and the cabin filled with the click of unbuckling seatbelts, I was no longer a woman blindsided on her anniversary. I was a woman who knew everything, who had a head start her husband couldn't imagine, and who had decided, somewhere over that ocean, exactly what she was going to do. I'll tell you the one merciful thing I did, the thing I'm proudest of in this whole story. As we gathered our bags from the overhead bins, I made a quiet decision about Olivia. She had been lied to as thoroughly as I had told I was a cold roommate, told he was leaving, sold a future that did not exist. She wasn't my enemy. She was simply the other woman Spencer had deceived, sitting one seat over, glowing with a love that had never been real. So as we walked up the jet bridge, I said gently, "Olivia, I hope you find someone who's actually free to love you. You deserve a man who isn't lying to two women at once." She looked at me, confused, and I just smiled and walked on, and I let her work out, in her own time, what I had meant. I did not need to humiliate her. The truth would do that for me, quietly, the moment she understood it. I've been asked, by people I've told this story to, why I was kind to her at all, why I didn't use that moment on the jet bridge to land one devastating blow, to let her know exactly whose husband she'd been sleeping with, and exactly who she'd spent 4 hours confiding in. And the honest answer is that I looked at Olivia and I did not see a villain. I saw a younger version of a story I knew too well, a woman who had been lied to with the same practiced lines, who genuinely believed she was loved, who was about to have her own heart broken the moment she connected the dots. Spencer had made us into rivals in his mind, two prizes in his clever little game. I refused to play the role he'd written. My fury belonged to him, the one who had lied to both of us, not to her, the one who had been lied to alongside me. There is a kind of strength in refusing to aim your pain at the wrong target. The easy thing would have been to make her my enemy. The truer thing was to recognize that we'd been wounded by the same hand. Then and now, fully joined, on the ground. Spencer came home 2 days later from the last of his anniversary trip, tanned and relaxed and utterly unaware that his wife had flown home beside his girlfriend and now held the entire map of his double life. And while he'd been finishing his vacation, lying on a beach with no idea his entire life had already quietly ended, I had not been idle. I had quietly gone to a lawyer. I had begun, calmly and lawfully, with my lawyer's guidance, to document everything, including the marital money Olivia had so helpfully told me he'd spent on their second life, the trips and the gifts, dissipation of our shared assets that I could now look for and find, because a stranger on a plane had told me exactly where to look. This is the part people underestimate about what happened on that flight, so let me make it concrete. Olivia hadn't just confirmed the affair, which I already half knew. She had, in her dreamy, unguarded way, handed me a map of where our marital money had gone. The weekend trips she mentioned, the jewelry she was wearing that he'd given her, the restaurants, the hotels, the gifts. To her, these were romantic details, proof that she was loved. To me, sitting beside her, they were line items, marital funds, our shared money, spent in secret on a second life. Every one of them now something I knew to look for in our accounts and could document. A betrayed spouse usually has to hire a forensic accountant to even guess where the money went. I had been handed the itemized list, lovingly, by the person it had been spent on. That is the strange arithmetic of that flight. The same conversation that broke my heart also built my case. When the time came, I did not scream at Spencer about the affair. I, simply, calmly, let him understand how much I knew the resort, the balcony calls, the restaurant, the photo on the beach, the timeline, the spending. I watched him try to reach for an explanation and find that there was no explanation that survives your wife having interviewed your mistress for 4 hours at 30,000 feet. The divorce was clean and strong because the truth was complete and the documentation was airtight. And because the affair and the proven spending on it did him no favors at all in the eyes of anyone deciding what was fair, he never did figure out how I knew so much. He spent a great deal of energy trying to work out who had told me, suspecting friends, suspecting his own brother, suspecting everyone except the one person it had actually been. Because the truth was something his mind simply could not reach. That the universe had sat his wife and his girlfriend in the same row and let them talk for 4 hours. I never told him about seat 14B. Some things you keep, just for yourself. People sometimes expect the climax of a story like this to be loud, the screaming confrontation, the thrown drink, the public destruction. Mine was the opposite, and I've come to believe the quiet version was far more powerful. When I finally sat across from Spencer and let him understand piece by piece how completely I knew his secret life, there was no shouting. And that was precisely what unnerved him. A screaming wife he could have managed. He had a whole repertoire for that. The wounded defenses, the counterattacks, the way of making my anger the problem. But a calm wife laying out the resort, the balcony calls, the restaurant, the photo, the timeline, the spending with no heat, just facts left him nothing to push against. He kept waiting for me to explode so he could become the victim of my reaction. I never gave him the chance. I just kept calmly placing the truth on the table between us, one piece at a time, until there was nothing of his story left standing. Calm, it turns out, is the one move a man like that cannot counter, because his entire skill set is built for managing other people's emotions. And I simply declined to hand him mine. And if you'll let me leave you with one thing, not just as someone who got revenge, but as a woman who learned the truth about her own marriage, from a kind stranger, on a plane, it's this. The truth has a way of finding you, even at 30,000 feet, even from the mouth of someone who has no idea they're delivering it. And when it finds you, the most powerful thing you can do is not to react, but to receive it, to stay calm enough to let the whole truth arrive before you do anything with it. A scene at 30,000 feet would have given me one bright, satisfying moment of release and cost me everything that came after. Silence at 30,000 feet, held all the way to the ground, gave me my entire freedom. The people who truly love you are not running 2 stories on the same island. The ones who are will, eventually, be undone by the simple fact that the world is smaller than their lies and that sometimes the wife and the girlfriend end up in the same row, and only the calm one walks away with everything. There's one more thing, though, a few weeks after the divorce. Olivia found me. She'd worked out who I was, exactly as I knew she would, and she reached out, not in anger, but to tell me something. Something Spencer had told her late one night on that island about why he'd really planned the anniversary trip in the first place, a reason that had nothing to do with love and everything to do with a secret he'd been keeping from me for years. What she told me, and what I did once I understood it, is a story entirely its own. And it might just be the most satisfying one yet. It's right there on your screen. You are going to want to see how that one ends.